The rain had been falling on Albany for 6 straight hours by the time it found its way onto Sadie Ivers's fire escape, and it was still falling when the buzzer sounded at her apartment door, not the lobby buzzer, which meant a neighbor had already let someone in, but the door itself, 3 floors up, at 20 minutes to 10 on a Tuesday in October. She was at her desk when it happened, a legal pad open in front of her, outlining a seminar paper due Thursday, the radiator ticking beside her like something counting down. She looked up. She did not move for a full 5 seconds, the way a person doesn't move when a sound doesn't match any sound they were expecting. Then she crossed the room and put her eye to the peephole, and the fisheye lens showed her a woman in a raincoat gone dark at the shoulders, hair grown back past her ears, dark at the roots where it hadn't been given the chance to fade, holding something against her ribs the way you hold a thing you have rehearsed holding. It was her sister. It was Brooke. 2 years. Sadie did the arithmetic without meaning to, the way you touch a bruise to see if it still answers, and the number that came back was 700 and some days since she had last stood this close to this particular person, on the other side of a kitchen table instead of a door, sliding across it a folder that would end an engagement, a fundraising campaign, and the version of her family she had spent 26 years believing was true. She did not open the door. Not yet. She stood with her palm flat against the wood and did what she had always done best. Long before any of this began, she catalogued. The wet shoulders. The absence of a scarf. The steadiness of the breathing on the other side, in for 4, out for 4, the kind of breath a person practices in a car before they can make themselves get out of it. Brooke knocked twice, softly, the knuckles of someone who has learned not to demand. "Sadie," she said, close to the wood. "It's me. I'm not here to ask you to forget anything." Sadie's hand found the deadbolt. "I came to ask if you think we can ever be sisters again," Brooke said. "That's the whole question. You can just say no through the door." To understand what stood on the other side of that door, you have to go back 3 years, to an April afternoon and an elevator that smelled faintly of someone's dry cleaning, because that was the day the whole architecture of the family shifted, though nobody but Sadie felt the ground move. She was 26. She had spent 5 years by then as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm on the edge of downtown, work she was good at because she had a mind built for finding the loose thread, the date that didn't line up, the signature that had been added a beat too late, the number that almost, but did not quite, add up to the number claimed. She liked the work the way some people like crossword puzzles. It made the world briefly legible. Nights and weekends, for 2 years, she had studied for the LSAT in a middle school gymnasium that smelled of floor wax and other people's nerves. She had applied to exactly one school, an Ivy League law program in Manhattan, because application fees were real money to a woman paying her own rent, and on a Tuesday in April, standing in the elevator of her building with a grocery bag cutting a line into her wrist, she opened the email. Admitted, with a scholarship covering half. She read it 4 times between the lobby and the 3rd floor. She read it once more with her back against her own front door. And she made a sound in that empty hallway that she would have denied making in a deposition. The next morning she printed the letter at the office and stuck it to her refrigerator with a small brass magnet shaped like the scales of justice, a gag gift from her boss 2 Christmases prior, and she stood in her kitchen looking at that letter the way other people look at sonograms. Here is the thing worth knowing about Sadie, the thing that explains everything that came after. Her very first thought, before the joy had even finished landing in her chest, was how do I say this without causing trouble? She drafted the announcement in her head the way she drafted a settlement letter at work, worded for minimum disturbance, structured to leave no opening for anyone to feel slighted by her good fortune. In her family, good news had always needed a bodyguard. She didn't know yet that this particular piece of good news was about to be ambushed by a diagnosis that did not exist. To explain what happened to that acceptance letter, you first have to meet the house Sadie grew up in, the way she herself had to meet it, from the inside, over and over, until the pattern finally had a name. Her mother, Lynn, had spent 30 years as an emergency room nurse, and she was good at it, the kind of good that meant strangers trusted her with the worst hour of their lives and were right too. But you cannot spend 3 decades running triage and leave the habit at the hospital doors. Triage has one rule, and the rule is simple, and the rule had, without anyone choosing it, become the operating system of the household. Whoever is bleeding worst gets seen first. Brooke, 4 years older than Sadie, had understood this rule before she could have explained it. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't calculating, not at first. She was something closer to a weather system, a low-pressure front that reliably arrived wherever the barometric conditions of the family called for one. A fever the morning of a field trip. A fainting spell at her own high school graduation party. Chest pains the night before Sadie's college commencement, an emergency room visit that turned out to be panic, and a family who spent the ceremony 200 miles away beside a vending machine while strangers heard Sadie's name called into a microphone. Sadie never doubted that Brooke's crises felt real to her as she was living them. That was what made them impossible to fight. You cannot argue with a flood by pointing out that the sky looks clear from where you're standing. And Sadie became the other thing that a house built on bleeding will always produce, given enough years, the easy one. The one who needs nothing. She moved out at 18. She paid her own way. She called home every Sunday, arrived with a salad she'd made herself, and left before the dishes could turn into a conversation that required anything of her. She had seen the pattern her whole life. Seeing patterns was, after all, the thing she was good at. Her solution, without ever naming it as a solution, had been to make herself small, solvent, and slightly out of range. It had worked, more or less, for years. The flaw in the design was simple, and she wouldn't understand it until much later. She had never once brought anything home that was big enough to be worth someone else taking. And then, that April, for the first time in her life, she did. She announced it at Sunday dinner, between the roast and the coffee, in the exact casual register she'd rehearsed for 3 days. Law school. The city. A scholarship, starting in the fall. For about 15 minutes, it was wonderful. Her father, Tom, a print shop machinist who treated words the way he treated overtime, sparingly, and only when the job required it, stood up and hugged her with ink-stained hands and said, "First lawyer in the family," twice, as if he were testing how the sentence sounded out loud before he trusted it. Her mother cried a little and asked the practical questions a nurse asks: housing, health insurance, how far from a hospital? 15 minutes. Sadie knows the length exactly, because she has replayed that dinner more times than she could count, and the turn always arrives in the same place. Her mother reached across the table, squeezed her hand, and said, "Warm as anything, you always land on your feet." She meant it as praise. Sadie filed it away as praise, for almost a year. It would take her that long to hear the sentence for what it actually was, not a compliment but a license, the paperwork you sign when you've quietly decided that one of your children doesn't need catching, so that your hands stay free for the one who does. Across the table, Brooke had gone very quiet. Genuinely quiet, unusually so. She had offered a congratulations at the right beat, hugged Sadie at the right angle, and then sat for the rest of the meal with both hands wrapped around her water glass as if she were trying to keep warm in a house with the heat on. Watching the attention move around the table like a dish that hadn't come around to her plate yet. Sadie noticed. Noticing was, after all, her one marketable skill. She told herself Brooke and her fiancé Grant had probably argued in the car. 3 weeks later, Brooke called a family meeting of her own. She sat them down on a Sunday, in the living room instead of the kitchen, which, in that family, was the difference between a private conversation and an address to the nation. Grant stood behind her chair with both hands on her shoulders. And Brooke, 30 years old, looked around at the 3 people who loved her most in the world and told them she had stage 4 lymphoma. 6 months to 2 years, she said, her chin lifted, dry-eyed and brave, right up until the exact moment their mother reached her, and then the 2 of them folded together onto the carpet, while their father stood in the middle of his own living room, turning his reading glasses over and over in his hands like a man trying to remember what hands were for. Sadie sat frozen on the edge of the couch, and inside the freeze, 2 things were fighting each other, and she hated the second one. Because even in that first terrible hour, small things had already begun to snag on her, the way a wrong date snags on a person who reads contracts for a living. Brooke had named her treatment plan too smoothly, the syllables polished, no stumble, no reaching for the word, the way people speak lines they've said before rather than facts they're learning to hold for the first time. She had answers before there were questions. The story had no loose threads, and Sadie had spent 5 years learning that real stories, the true and terrible kind, always have loose threads. Grief is messy. This wasn't. She strangled every one of those thoughts before they could take a full breath. What kind of person audits her dying sister? By nightfall, their mother had a legal pad out, building the thing she built best, a care plan. Sadie watched her own name go onto it before anyone had asked her a single question. Sadie, Wednesdays. Sadie, appointments. Sadie's schedule is flexible, she hasn't started school yet. That last line spoken aloud, in front of her, in the voice reserved for settled matters. She tried. She needs it understood how hard she tried to do this the right way. She asked to come to one appointment, just to sit in the waiting room, just to hold Brooke's coat. I need one thing that's only mine, Brooke said, her eyes brimming, and what kind of monster argues with that? She asked for the oncologist's name so their mother could help coordinate records. He's at a private center in Latham. I'll text it to you. The text never came, and asking a second time felt like an accusation dressed as a favor. She offered to handle the insurance paperwork. She did exactly this kind of work professionally. It would have cost her one weekend. The social work team handles all of it, Sadie. Please stop trying to manage my cancer. Every door she knocked on closed with perfect, gentle, medical manners, vocabulary Brooke had absorbed across the same dinner table Sadie had grown up at. You cannot subpoena your own sister. And thanks to privacy law, you cannot call a hospital and simply ask whether a person is a patient there. Those walls exist for good reasons. They also happen to work perfectly well for other purposes. So she did the only thing left to her. She called her law school's admissions office and asked about deferral. 1 year, they told her, granted only for documented family emergencies, and only once. After that, you reapply from zero, and the scholarship does not follow you back through the door. She remembers the admissions officer's voice, kind and final, the way a nurse's voice is kind and final. She signed the form at her own kitchen table, under the acceptance letter still pinned to her refrigerator, the little brass scales holding it flat while she postponed her life by a year for a disease she would spend that entire year failing to find. The year found its rhythm quickly. Wednesdays belonged to Sadie. She would pick Brooke up at 9, drive her 40 minutes to the medical plaza, and drop her at the main entrance, because Brooke was firm about that part. Don't park, don't wait, infusions run 4 or 5 hours and I don't want you watching me come out weak. It sounded like dignity. It read as dignity, cleanly, the way a well-drafted clause reads as fair until you notice what it quietly protects. Brooke's head had already been shaved by then, done herself, preemptively, the week after the announcement, before a single round of treatment. I want to beat it to the punch, she'd said, and everyone had cried, and Sadie has to hand it to her, even now, it was the single most convincing thing her sister ever did. You look at a shaved head, and your body believes before your brain gets a vote. The church started a fund. $17,400 in under 2 months, bake sales, a spaghetti dinner, a widower who gave up a deposit on a fishing boat trip he'd been planning for a year. Casseroles stacked in the parents' freezer in labeled layers like sediment, like something being deposited by a very patient river. Their mother cut back her hours. Their father started saying even fewer words than usual. And every Wednesday, Sadie drove, and watched her sister walk through the sliding doors with her chin up, and some weeks she sat in the visitor lot anyway, against every instruction, telling herself she stayed to be nearby, knowing on some level she stayed because something in her was keeping watch. She would like to claim it was only love. It was partly love. But she had spent 5 years learning to check things for a living, and some part of that checking runs below the surface like a pilot light, small, patient, refusing to go out no matter how little fuel you feed it. All that autumn it burned low in her, and she fed it nothing, and still it wouldn't die. The first crack, fittingly, was made of paper, because in Sadie's life the important things always seemed to arrive on a Wednesday. Late October. She had dropped Brooke at the main entrance as instructed, then, because it was raining and she wanted coffee and makes no apologies for it, parked anyway and gone in through a side door to the lobby cafe. She nursed the coffee, read case summaries, lost track of the hour entirely, until her phone buzzed against the table. Brooke. Done early today. Easy session. Where are you? 22 minutes. That was what the parking machine printed on the ticket when she fed it her card, 22 minutes, gate to gate, for a chemotherapy infusion her sister had described, more than once and in detail, as a 4 to 5 hour ordeal. In the car, Brooke was bright and chatty, scarf knotted precisely where hair used to be, narrating her easy session with specifics, which nurse, which chair, the little cups of juice they hand out afterward. Sadie drove and nodded and felt each detail land wrong, one after another, the way numbers land wrong on a page you've read too many times to trust your own eyes about anymore. Easy sessions exist. Schedules change. Maybe it was only blood work. Maybe a consult. She gave her sister every benefit of the doubt a careful clerk gives a document before flagging it as a problem. But that night, alone in her apartment, she did the thing she can never take back. She flattened the parking receipt on her kitchen counter, and she put it in a folder. At work, she opened a file whenever a claim deserved to be tested. She opened this one praying she would get to close it unopened, so to speak, praying the file would confirm nothing and she could throw it away with a clean conscience. The file, it turned out, had other plans. 2 weeks later, during what the family calendar called Brooke's heavy chemo week, Sadie stopped by the apartment Brooke shared with Grant, carrying a container of plain broth, the only food Brooke had told them she could reliably keep down that week. Grant's car wasn't in the driveway. Through the front window, before she had even knocked, Sadie saw her dying sister at the kitchen island, laughing into her phone, working her way steadily through a takeout container of drunken noodles, the kind Brooke had always ordered dangerously spicy, the kind that had once, famously, made Grant cry at a food court table. Her scarf was off. Her scalp shone, freshly maintained, under the pendant light. She looked, from the sidewalk, completely and radiantly fine. Sadie stood there with her little container of broth going lukewarm in her hands and watched her sister be well. And then she knocked, and by the time the door opened, the noodles were gone, the scarf was back on, and Brooke's voice had dropped into the register the whole family had come to recognize as brave. "You're an angel. I probably can't keep anything down today." But the plain broth was thanked for anyway. "Light day," she said. "New anti-nausea medication," she said. There was, as always, an answer for everything. At work, the file with an answer for every single question was always the file Sadie chose to pull first. She drove home, sat at her counter, and added a line to the folder in her clean, careful print, date, time, what she'd seen, no adjectives. Then she closed it, and rested her palm flat on the cover, the way you'd quiet something with a heartbeat. Some files, once opened, start keeping you, instead of the other way around. In January, the money moved. Her parents had a fund, $12,000 saved slowly over a decade, overtime shifts, and pinched grocery budgets, money they had promised Sadie years earlier for her first year living costs in the city. Her mother told her about the change the way you'd mention a schedule shift while unloading a dishwasher. Sadie could hear the plates clinking through the phone. "We're putting it toward Brooke's supplemental care. There's a healing retreat in Sedona her support group swears by, integrative medicine, the insurance won't touch it. Of course you understand." And then, into Sadie's silence, the sentence arrived again, warm as a heating pad laid across an old wound. "You'll land on your feet, honey. You always do." She stood in her kitchen listening to plates click into a rack 200 miles away, and for the first time in her life she heard that sentence with the wrapping taken off it. It was not a compliment. It was an invoice, marked paid in advance. She was the daughter whose feet were the family's insurance policy. Brooke was the daughter whose falls the family existed to catch. And a wellness retreat in the Red Rocks of Arizona was about to consume her first year's rent, underwritten by a diagnosis she could not verify, prescribed by a doctor whose name no one seemed able to produce. She said something agreeable and small, because 40 years of training does not dissolve inside a single phone call. Then she hung up, took the folder from its drawer, and turned to a fresh page. Here's what she knew by then, in her bones if not yet on paper: grief spends money forward, in a straight line, toward hospitals and treatments and things with receipts. Fraud spends money sideways, toward things with spas. And here is what she still did not have the nerve to write down, even in her own careful hand. Her mother had mentioned, with something close to pride, that Brooke had saved money by booking the non-refundable tier of the retreat. Dying people, Sadie would later come to understand, rarely gamble on their own attendance. Her sister had never once missed a payment. Or a pedicure. She needs it understood exactly how she found what she found, because the manner of finding a truth matters almost as much as the truth itself. She did not hack anything. She did not steal a file or record a phone call. She did what she did at her desk every working day of her life: she read what was already public, slowly, and then again. The church's fundraising page had updates, and the updates had photographs. Fight Day, read one caption, and there sat her sister in a recliner, scarf on, thumbs up, brave, and 4 line taped along the inside of her forearm. Sadie had looked at that photograph perhaps a dozen times already on her phone, the way half the county had. That night, she looked at it on her laptop, full screen, the way she looked at exhibits at work. The taped line stopped at the tape. No catheter beneath it. No port, no hub. Just tubing laid against bare skin, going nowhere, dressed in medical tape like a costume wearing a costume. She zoomed out. On Brooke's wrist, a hospital admission band. She zoomed in. The printed text was half legible, and legible enough. An admission date from years earlier. The night of the chest pains. The eve of Sadie's college commencement. She had kept the band. She had kept it, and worn it again as a prop, and that prop had been load-bearing for $17,000 of other people's grocery money. Sadie sat back from the laptop, and the room went very quiet, the particular quiet that settles over a room after a verdict. There is a sensation that happens in her chest when a file finally confesses something, a cold click, like a lock deciding. She had felt it many times at work, and it had always, until that night, felt like winning. That night it felt like watching a door close on a house she'd grown up inside. She printed both photographs, marked them the way she marked exhibits, and slid them in behind the parking receipts. The folder was becoming a case. And cases, in her experience, do not stay quietly in trunks forever. The following Wednesday she finally did the thing she had been refusing to do for months. She dropped Brooke at the main entrance, watched her walk in with her chin lifted, and then, instead of driving home, pulled into the visitor lot and waited, eyes on the side exit, hating herself in a calm, organized sort of way that felt worse than any hot anger could have. 25 minutes. That was how long her sister spent inside a cancer center on an infusion Wednesday. At the 25-minute mark, Brooke came out the side door in sunglasses, scarf off, moving like a woman between errands, and climbed into Grant's gray sedan, which had been idling at the curb the entire time. They pulled away, laughing at something. Sadie didn't follow. She didn't take a photograph, it would have proven nothing anyway. A woman may leave a building. She sat in her parked car with both hands at 10 and 2, as if she were still driving somewhere, and she understood, finally and completely, that there had never been a Wednesday. Not one. The chair, the nurse, the little cups of juice, her sister had built a set and furnished it week after week with detail, and cast Sadie in the role of driver. For 13 months she had been the transportation department of a play. And Grant, she once had understood that Grant was a casualty in all this too, not a co-conspirator. A man who believed he was ferrying his fiancée from lymphoma to lunch. Grant was simply another audience member with a better seat. She drove home under the speed limit the entire way, which for her is a 5-alarm symptom. At her counter, she wrote the date and 2 lines, no adjectives, and closed the folder. Then she opened it again and counted what she had. 9 parking stamps. 2 photographs. 1 worn hospital band. 0 doctors. What she still lacked was the one piece that couldn't be explained away by a tired woman with a private streak. She needed a name. Before the name, there is a story she has to tell about a summer, because it's the only way any of what came next makes the kind of sense that keeps a person human, rather than merely correct. Her father told it to her that February, on the back porch, both of them in coats, him holding a beer he had no intention of drinking. Brooke was 12. She went off the rope swing at the quarry sideways and hit the shallow shelf, and the break was bad, surgery, pins, a cast from hip to ankle, an entire summer spent flat on her back. Their mother, who had never in living memory taken more than 3 consecutive days off work, took the whole summer unpaid. She set up a cot in Brooke's room. She made popsicles from concentrate and read her the entire Little House series cover to cover and charted her daughter's pain the way she charted a patient she was, for once, allowed to love out loud, without a triage bay full of strangers competing for the same attention. Sadie was 8 that summer. She spent it at her grandmother's house, and she remembers it, still, as the summer she learned to make her own sandwiches. She remembers being proud of that. Proud. You see it, don't you? Her father looked out at the yard and said the part he had apparently carried, unspoken, for 20 years. The day the cast came off, your sister cried like somebody died. I thought it was the pain, Sadie. It took me a long time to understand she was crying because summer was over. 2 little girls. 1 house. 1 exhausted woman doing triage all day at work and then coming home to do it again, unpaid, for love. Brooke learned, at 12, that broken gets you tended to. Sadie learned, without anyone ever saying it aloud, that whole gets you left alone, and she had spent 2 decades calling that independence, and building a whole life out of it. Neither of them, in the end, had ever once been looked at simply because someone wanted to look. Sadie is not interested in excusing what her sister did. She is only interested in telling you where the disease actually began, because it was never, not really, in Brooke's lymph nodes. By March, the folder was complete except for a single tab, and it had long since outgrown the kitchen drawer, or maybe, by then, she had simply stopped being able to eat breakfast next to it. It was an accordion folder now, the maroon kind they used at work for closed cases. Receipts in date order. Photographs sleeved in plastic. Her notes typed and printed. She had labeled the empty tab physician, and it sat there like a missing tooth in an otherwise complete set. Then she did something she has never told another living soul until now. She put the folder in the trunk of her car, tucked it under the spare tire, and drove around with it there for 11 days. To work. To Sunday dinner. To the pharmacy. 11 days of merging onto the highway with what felt like a live grenade riding under her spare tire, checking the mirrors as if the truth itself might be tailing her. She couldn't bring it inside her parents' house, and she couldn't quite bring it back inside her own apartment either. So it lived, for 11 days, in the one space she owned that no one else ever thought to ask about. Those 11 days, she has come to understand, were her giving her sister 11 more chances to simply be dying. Meanwhile, the clock she had been trying so hard to ignore had started chiming again. June 1st, her enrollment confirmation deadline, the hard edge of the 1-year deferral, was 10 weeks out, and her mother had begun saying things like obviously fall is impossible in the exact settled tone she once used for the care plan. Another year, she meant, except there was no another year available to Sadie. There was only forfeiture, and reapplying from zero, and the scholarship gone for good. When Sadie explained the actual policy, the printed rule, the one she had read 4 times over the phone with an admissions officer, her mother looked at her the way you look at someone doing arithmetic at a funeral. And Brooke, from the couch, said gently, "It's okay, Mom." Sadie's dreams have always been portable. Sadie drove home that night with the folder humming under the spare tire like a second engine. 10 weeks. 1 empty tab. And a sister who had just, very softly, called her entire life a suitcase. The wedding got moved up that spring, because time isn't guaranteed, Brooke told the family, and the family wept and nodded, and the church added a second fundraiser dinner to the calendar to help the young couple marry before the Lord called her home. Sadie knows how that sentence sounds now, laid out plainly like this. People believed it, and they believed it because believing it made them decent, and con artists, whatever else can be said of them, eat decency for fuel. That part is not the church's fault, and she has never once blamed them for it. Brooke asked Sadie to be her maid of honor, in front of everyone, which is the only way Brooke had ever asked her for anything in her entire life. And so, one Saturday, Sadie stood in a bridal shop holding fabric swatches while her dying sister tried on gowns and glowed, flushed with the quiet attention of 3 shop attendants who had been told, in careful whispers, her story. In the fitting room mirror, looking at herself rather than at Sadie, Brooke said the things Sadie thinks about more than almost anything else that happened that year. You have your whole future, Sadie. All I have is this year. The year everybody finally sees me. She said it lightly, like a joke about the price of champagne. The room went quiet for 1 second too long, the particular quiet of a courtroom when a witness answers a question nobody actually asked. Then an attendant laughed kindly, and the moment closed back over like water finding its level. But Sadie had heard it. Not a confession, Brooke was too fluent a performer for that, more like the accounting behind the entire production, glimpsed for one blink through a ledger someone had forgotten to close. This year, everybody finally sees me. Not this year I'm sick. Not this year I'm dying. Just, seen. That was the product Brooke had been purchasing this entire time, at market rate, with Sadie's year as the currency. Sadie zipped her sister into the next gown, and her own hands, she remembers with something like disbelief now, were perfectly steady. That was the moment she knew the folder was coming out from under the spare tire. She tried her father first, because he was the closest thing the family had to neutral ground. Back porch again. Coats again. She didn't show him the folder, she led with one gentle fact, the way you test a witness before you commit to a line of questioning. She's never once given anyone the doctor's name. A whole year. Doesn't that seem strange to you, Dad? Her father, who she had watched shrink by roughly an inch over the course of that year, did not look surprised. That was the terrible part. He looked out at the yard he had mowed for 30 summers, and his jaw worked, and what he finally said, very quietly, was this. Don't make your mother choose, Sadie. I'm asking you, please. Because she won't pick you. That sentence still lives somewhere under Sadie's ribs. Not she'd never believe it. Not you're wrong. Her father had run the numbers, she came to understand, long before she had, maybe years before, and had chosen the only kind of survival he understood, which was to keep the household weather calm and to love both his daughters from somewhere deep inside his own silence. The one person in that family who suspected what Sadie suspected was begging her to help him go on not knowing it. She looked at him and understood that if she put the folder on the table without an ally in the room, her mother's first instinct would not be to read it. It would be to find out who had hurt her bleeding daughter. And it would be Sadie. What finally ended the swallowing wasn't anger. It was arithmetic. The second fundraiser had a printed goal, $10,000 more, for experimental treatment out of state. Sadie sat in a pew that Sunday and watched the pastor hold up her sister's photograph to the congregation, and she did the sum she had been refusing to do for months. $17,400 already given. $10,000 more being solicited. Her parents' $12,000. Her own scholarship year, unpriceable. And every dollar of it raised on a diagnosis whose only supporting document, as far as she could determine, was a shaved head. She had spent 5 years preparing files for a law office, and she knew the words that eventually get typed onto cases like this one. Charitable fraud. Obtaining property by false pretenses. Words with sentencing ranges attached. What finally moved her, if she is honest, and she has decided, this many years out, that honesty is owed to this particular story, wasn't the purest motive. She realized her silence now had a legal texture to it. She wasn't a sad sister with a hunch anymore. She was a person sitting on an accordion folder of evidence while new donations rolled in. There is a word for people who know, and say nothing, while the collection plate keeps moving. She had typed that word onto enough documents at work to feel it looking back at her now. But it wasn't only that, and she won't pretend it was. That same Sunday, an usher's wife she had known since childhood pressed a folded 20 into the collection basket, then squeezed Sadie's hand and said, "Your family is so strong." Sadie smiled back at this good woman giving up $20 she almost certainly needed for something else, and she felt the smile happen on her own face like something worn over the skin rather than felt underneath it. She understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that she was in the play now too. She had a costume. She had lines. The only difference between her performance and her sister's was that hers was, for the moment, still legal. 10 weeks had become 6. She needed the name. She got the name by being family, which is, she has come to think, its own particular kind of confession. Sunday dinner. Dessert. Everyone soft with pie. She asked it as logistics, not as a challenge, no edge in it at all, clipboard voice, she calls it now. For the retreat forms, who should mom list as your primary oncologist? Just in case. Brooke, 13 months deep into a story nobody had questioned, answered on autopilot, reaching for her coffee. Dr. Corwin. At the Latham Center. Tossed off like pocket change. Their mother wrote the name on her legal pad, grateful, as always, for something concrete to write down. Dinner rolled on. Sadie sat with her pie and her racing heart, because she knew something the rest of the table did not. Physician licenses are public record. Every state runs a lookup. Almost nobody ever bothers to check. That night, at her kitchen counter, she typed the name into New York's physician database. No results. She widened the search to every plausible spelling, Corwin, Corwin, Corwin with 1 R, with 2, and to every specialty, every county, then every bordering state. There is no oncologist named Corwin within 100 miles of Albany. There is, as far as any public record can show, no Dr. Corwin at all. She printed the empty search screen at 1 in the morning. It remains, she thinks, the saddest exhibit she has ever filed. She sat in her kitchen while 14 months finished rearranging themselves into their true shape. Then she did the last decent thing she could think of. She drove to Brooke's house the next evening, while Grant was still at work, set a single parking stamp down on the kitchen counter, and said, 48 hours. You tell Mom and Dad the truth, whatever the truth is, or I show them what I have. Her sister looked at the small paper rectangle, and Sadie watched the entire performance drain out of her face the way water finds a crack in old plaster. For 5 full seconds, she met the person underneath. Dry-eyed. Level. Almost bored. Sick beats smart in this house, Brooke said. It always has. Then the mask slid back into place, and she asked, perfectly pleasantly, whether Sadie wanted tea. Brooke did not use the 48 hours to confess. She used them to reload. At hour 40, on a Tuesday evening, Sadie's phone lit up with a message in the family group chat, Brooke has news. Everyone at Mom and Dad's, 7 o'clock. She drove over with the folder in her trunk and her heart going like a filing clerk against a deadline, because she already knew. You learn a person's moves after a year of cataloging them. They assembled in the living room, the address to the nation room. Grant stood behind her chair. Their mother was already reaching for her hand. And Brooke looked around at her small, devoted audience and told them the cancer had spread to her brain. There were sounds in that room Sadie will hear for the rest of her life. Through all of it, Brooke's eyes found hers, just once, for less than a second, and there was nothing in them that matched the performance in her voice. Sadie understood the message, because it was addressed to her and to no one else in that room. Your move was never going to matter. Escalation as armor. A brain lesion, deployed to make any accusation unspeakable, because who interrogates a woman with tumors in her head? And if her details wobbled now, well, that's simply the lesions talking. It was, Sadie has to admit even now, with the very particular horror of a professional admiring an opposing filing, airtight. The benefit dinner got moved up again. A cousin started a prayer chain. Their mother began researching out-of-state clinical trials on her phone before the meeting had even fully broken up. Sadie hugged her sister goodbye at the door, along with everyone else, and Brooke's scarf smelled like their shared childhood shampoo, and she whispered, close to Sadie's ear, "Thank you for coming." 48 hours Sadie had given her. Brooke had spent every one of them building a fortress out of the family's love. Thursday night, Sadie called and asked for the three of them, her parents, and Brooke, no Grant, to meet at the kitchen table, not the living room. The kitchen, in that house, was where Fax had always lived, somewhere between the bills and the salt shaker. She laid the folder out the way she had watched attorneys do it for years, no speech, one exhibit at a time. 9 parking stamps, in date order, gate to gate, none longer than 40 minutes against 13 months of supposed 4-hour infusions. The fundraiser photograph, full page, the taped tubing that connected to nothing. The hospital wristband, enlarged, its admission date 3 years old. And last, the printout, New York State physician lookup. All spellings, all specialties, all bordering states. No results found. Her mother fought it exactly the way you'd expect a lifelong nurse to fight it, technically. Parking validation errors. Photographs compress badly online. Private centers are built differently. Lookup databases lag behind reality. She stood at her own kitchen counter cross-examining paper, because paper can be wrong, and daughters, in her mind, cannot. Her father sat with one hand flat over the parking stamps, not moving, as if he were trying to keep them warm. Sadie asked the only question she had actually rehearsed, and she asked it to Brooke, not to their mother. "What are you taking?" "Name one drug." "Not the protocol, I know you know the protocol by heart." "One pill from your own kitchen." "One bottle I can hold in my hand." The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car passed with its radio on. Their mother turned to her oldest daughter, expecting the answer that would finally put Sadie in her place. And Brooke looked around the bottleless kitchen of her 31 years, and began, very quietly, to come apart. It did not come apart the way it does in films, one clean confession, underscored by music. It came apart in strips. First anger, "How dare you, this is what you've always done," jealous, jealous, jealous. Then bargaining, "The doctor was real but private, the treatments were real but holistic, the money is mostly still there." Then, quieter and quieter, each strip landing and dying beside the exhibits on the table. What was left standing in their parents' kitchen was neither the dying swan nor the golden bride, but a 31-year-old woman shaking in a way no audience had ever been meant to witness. "At least when I'm sick," she said, the only fully true sentence Sadie had heard from her in 14 months, "Mom looks at me." Sadie watched those words hit her mother like weather hitting glass. And then she watched her mother do the thing she had known, since the porch conversation with her father, that her mother would do. She crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around Brooke, around the liar, the architect, the fraud, and held her shaking daughter with 30 years of trained, steady hands. Over Brooke's shoulder, their mother's eyes found Sadie, standing by her own folder. Her beautiful, accurate, worthless folder. "What did you do?" her mother said. Not to Brooke. To her. Sadie would like to tell you she said something equal to the moment. What she actually did was gather her exhibits, square their edges the way her hands go when they need a task, and say, very quietly, the sentence she had apparently been carrying her whole life without ever once hearing it out loud before now. "I land on my feet, Mom, because nobody in this family has ever once tried to catch me." Then she walked out of the warm kitchen into the cold car, and the collapse began without her. Here is what 14 months of performance costs, itemized, because she thinks in itemized lines, and because she has decided she owes the story its full accounting. That same night, Brooke went into crisis, a real one, the first real one. Sadie will not put the details of it on the page except to say that her mother recognized the danger with a nurse's eyes and drove her to the emergency room herself. This time, the hospital band carried the correct date. Brooke was evaluated, kept safe, and within the week entered a 90-day residential program voluntarily. A doctor whose name Sadie will actually print, Dr. Feld, eventually gave the thing its clinical name, factitious disorder, with a depression underneath it that had, it turned out, been running the projector for years. Grant learned everything on a Thursday and was gone by Sunday. The engagement ring came back to Sadie's parents by registered mail, which strikes her, even now, as the most Grant-shaped sentence she can construct. The church was told the truth by her father. She didn't know he had that particular sentence in him, and she isn't certain he did either, before he found it. Pastor Dale stood in a closed-door meeting while her parents promised full repayment of the $17,400, which they raised, in the end, by borrowing against a house they had owned outright for 30 years. No charges were ever filed. Mercy, in part. Repayment, mostly. Small towns, she has learned, bury their embarrassments even deeper than they bury their dead. And Sadie, the person who had, after all, told the true thing, and had the receipts to prove it, became, in the family's official oral history, the night everything happened. Not the lie. The telling. Her mother did not speak to her for 11 days. When she finally did, it was a single sentence left on a voicemail, tired as the end of a night shift. You did it in one evening, Sadie. I have to fix it for years. She enrolled on time, deposit paid on May 30th, 2 days inside the deadline, from the parking lot of a grocery store, because that happened to be where she was standing when she finally stopped waiting for anyone's permission. In August she packed her apartment into a rental van that nobody helped her load, tucked the acceptance letter and its brass magnet into the cup holder, and drove 2.5 hours south to Manhattan with the radio off. She had won. She would like you to sit with how completely she had won. The seat, the scholarship, the truth entered into the family record, the fraud stopped, the donors made whole again, every count decided in her favor. And she has never, in her whole life, felt anything as quiet as that first semester of law school. She studied in the library until it closed, because her studio apartment came furnished with exactly one chair. And some nights, walking home past lit restaurant windows, she would catch herself rehearsing, not case law, but the kitchen table. Refining what she'd said. Adding what she should have said. Objection sustained over and over, in the courtroom that had apparently opened for permanent business somewhere behind her own eyes, where the trial never once adjourned. That is the part nobody warns you about when they finally hand you the truth and tell you it will set you free. Being right, it turns out, is a meal that does not keep you full for long. The cards that arrived that first Christmas were signed Mom and Dad, in her father's handwriting. He called every month, from his lunch break, from the print shop parking lot. She could hear the presses running in the background, and they talked about her classes and his tomatoes, and never once, not a single time, about the thing itself. She understood the calls were being made from the driveway of a marriage still finding its footing, and she loved her father for making them anyway, and she let that be enough, because it had to be. Brooke wrote to her once, about a year in. By then she was out of the residential program and into the long, unglamorous stretch of outpatient care. Tuesdays, their father reported. Every single week, without a gap. The envelope arrived at Sadie's apartment in handwriting she would have known anywhere, and she did not open it. She told herself she would, when she was ready, and then she moved it from the counter to a drawer to a box, the way you move a thing you can neither keep close nor bring yourself to bury. It rode along to her second apartment inside that box. On moving day, at the end of her second year, the box tipped, and the envelope slid out onto the bare floor of the new place and lay there in the afternoon light, as if it had simply chosen its moment at last. She sat down on a milk crate and opened it. It was not what she had braced for. No excuses. No relitigating the case. No request to meet in person. It was an accounting, Brooke had learned, somewhere in all those Tuesdays, to itemize too. What she had taken from Sadie, named plainly, the year, the $12,000, the wedding at which Sadie would have stood beside her as a sister rather than a plaintiff, the mother Sadie had walked out of that kitchen without. What she had taken from the church, repaid now, down to the widower's boat deposit. What she owed their parents, a debt she was working off in installments, from a job at a garden nursery, of all the places in the world she might have landed. And then, alone on its own page, no punctuation softening it, nobody ever looked at me until something was killing me. So I made the something up. And then it almost was. Sadie read that line until the light in the room changed color around her. She did not write back. But she kept the letter, and for the first time in 2 years, she knew exactly where it was. Which brings us, at last, back to that Tuesday night, the rain against the windows, and a hand hovering over a deadbolt. She opened the door. Not wide, the width of a conversation, her palm still braced against the frame. The hallway light in her building runs the color of weak tea, and in it, her sister looked older than 33 and, somehow, more entirely herself than Sadie had ever seen her, like a photograph that had finally been developed correctly, after years of coming back overexposed. Up close, she could see the rain hadn't spared the folder tucked under Brooke's arm, and Brooke noticed her noticing, and held it a little tighter, and for the moment neither of them said anything about it. "Hi," Brooke said. "Hi," Sadie said. Groundbreaking stuff. They came, both of them, from a long line of people who narrate everything except the thing that actually matters. Then Brooke squared up the way a person does at a podium, and delivered the piece she'd clearly rehearsed, and Sadie could tell it was rehearsed, and she could also tell that the rehearsal kept collapsing on her sister as she spoke it, which is exactly how she knew it was real. Rehearsed real has a stutter that performed real never carries. Sadie had spent 13 months at 40 miles an hour every Wednesday learning to hear the difference. "I'm 2.5 years into treatment," Brooke said. "Tuesdays. I work at a nursery, plants, not babies. I pay mom and dad back on the 1st of every month. I'm not fixed. Dr. Feld says fixed isn't really the word, and I've stopped shopping for a better one." Her chin did something complicated. "I didn't come to ask you to forget. And I didn't come to perform being well. There's a version of the rest of our lives where you and I are just two women who share a mother and a Christmas card list. And before I let that be the whole answer, I had to stand here and ask you, out loud. Do you think we can ever be sisters again?" The rain ticked against the hallway window. Somewhere below, a neighbor's television laughed at something. And quietly, in her chest, a document Sadie knew by heart began, out of long habit, to recite itself. She'd had a speech ready, she should tell you. She had been drafting it for 2 years without quite admitting that's what all that drafting was, in the library, in the shower, at red lights. Her closing argument. It had sections. The year she lost, itemized. The mother she lost, exhibit by exhibit. The bridal shop. The side door. The little cups of juice. The 22 minutes. It was airtight and unanswerable, and she felt it cue itself up now in her chest like a career's worth of preparation finally being called to trial. And then she looked down at her sister's hands. Brooke was holding that ruined maroon folder the way a 12-year-old holds a cast, like the very thing that had hurt her was also, somehow, the only proof she'd ever mattered to anyone. The first line of the closing argument dissolved on Sadie's tongue, because she suddenly saw the whole courtroom for what it actually was. 2 years she had lived inside that trial. 2 years of being the wronged one, the right one, the one with the receipts, and it had kept her exactly as seen, exactly as fed, as Brooke's waiting rooms had ever kept Brooke. A different currency. The same starving economy. Brooke had bought attention with wounds. Sadie had bought her own sense of worth with grievance. They were both, it turned out, still their mother's daughters, billing the world for love in the only denominations either of them had ever been issued. So instead of the speech, she asked her 2 real questions, the only due diligence that still mattered to her now. "Are you still in treatment?" "Every Tuesday." 2.5 years. No gaps. "Who knows you're here tonight?" And her sister, who had never once in her life done anything without an audience, who had gotten engaged at Sadie's own birthday dinner and diagnosed herself into a congregation, looked at her in a dim hallway with rain still in her hair and said, "Nobody. This one couldn't have witnesses." That was sort of the point. That answer, more than any apology could have, is what moved Sadie's hand off the door frame. "Wait here," she said, which turned out to be, apparently, the exact words she says at the precise moment her old life ends. She went to her closet and pulled out, from the bottom of a box she had not properly unpacked in 2 apartments, her own maroon accordion folder, the one from the kitchen table. 9 parking stamps. 2 photographs. A printout that said, in plain type, "No results found." She carried it back to the door and held it out flat on both hands, the way you return something to its rightful owner. "Trade," she said. Brooke didn't move. She thought, for a moment, that Sadie was about to read the charges aloud. Honestly, some old prosecutorial instinct in Sadie thought so too, for half a second. "You asked if we can ever be sisters again," Sadie said instead, and her voice came out level. In the register she'd waited 2 years to hear from herself again. "The answer is no. Not the way you mean it. The sisters we were died at that kitchen table, Brooke. And they should have. One of us was performing sick, and the other one was performing fine, and neither of us had told the truth at that table since we were children." Brooke's chin came up. She didn't argue. "So here's what I can offer instead. First Saturday of every month, there's a coffee shop on my corner. 1 hour, a public table, and exactly 1 rule. We tell the truth. Small truths count. Bad truths count double. The first time either of us performs anything at that table, we're done. And I mean forever done. That's the whole offer. It isn't sisters again. It's sisters from scratch." Brooke was crying by then, the unphotogenic kind, the kind with no cameras built into it anywhere. Sadie put the folder into her sister's free hand. "This is yours to carry now," she said. "I've had it memorized for 2 years. The year, the money, the church, the lie, I could recite it in my sleep. And Brooke, that's the problem. I have been. You called it, back at that table. Sick beats smart in this house. Maybe it always did. But I've learned something they never taught at that kitchen table. Truth beats sick. It's the only thing that ever has. Somebody just has to be willing to go first." She held the folder out another inch. "I'm going first. I'm done being the clerk of your record. Carry your own file, or burn it at the nursery for all I care. It's off my shelf." Brooke took the whole weight of her own history onto one arm, next to whatever she'd already brought, and then held out the folder she herself had carried through the rain. Sadie took that one without knowing yet what it contained. They stood there in the tea-colored light, having traded evidence like 2 small nations exchanging prisoners of a war neither of them had wanted to start. Then Brooke put out her hand. "Sadie needs you to understand, in 29 years, she and her sister had hugged for cameras, and cried for audiences, but they had never once, not a single time, shaken hands." They shook hands. Brooke's grip was terrible, shaking, damp, entirely real. "First Saturday," Brooke said. "First Saturday," Sadie said, and closed the door softly, all the way, and stood with her palm flat against the wood, listening to her sister's footsteps go down the stairwell, lighter than they had come up. She sat down on her one good chair and opened what her sister had carried through the rain. Inside, a repayment ledger, handwritten, every installment to their parents dated and initialed across months and months of entries, the running balance shrinking, line by line, in round, careful schoolgirl numbers. A completion certificate from Dr. Feld's program, not private records, just the plain kind of document you might frame, if your life had gone a little differently. A photograph Sadie had never seen before, the 2 of them, maybe 6 and 10, in their grandmother's backyard, Sadie riding piggyback, both of them mid-laugh, taken before either girl had learned the lesson the house had waiting for her. And at the very bottom, in an envelope with Sadie's name on it, $1,200 in money orders, and one line in Brooke's handwriting, first installment of your 12,000. It will take me a while. That's rather the point. Sadie sat there a long time with the rain still going outside, one hand over her mouth. Then she cried, the short, violent, efficient kind, mostly a release valve doing its job. And when it passed, she understood what had actually just left her body. It wasn't Brooke. It was the case. 2 years of carrying an entire prosecution everywhere she went, and the whole weight of it had simply walked down her stairs, tucked under someone else's arm, exactly where it should have been resting all along. She texted her father one line before bed. She came by. "I'm okay. Call you tomorrow." And for the first time in 2 years, okay wasn't testimony. It was just the truth, small, imperfect, and entirely hers. It has been 6 months of first Saturdays now, so the accounting is owed. The first coffee lasted 40 minutes, and Sadie would estimate that 31 of those minutes were silence, but it was working silence, the kind two people sit inside side by side rather than aim at one another across a table. By the third Saturday, Brooke told her, plainly and without any set dressing at all, what the residential program had actually been like, and Sadie told her, in return, what the law library at 2 in the morning actually felt like. They discovered, somewhere in that exchange, that they had both spent those 2 years hiding inside institutions with excellent lighting. In March, Brooke texted her on a Friday night, "Can't make tomorrow. Migraine." And then, before Sadie had even had time to answer, a second text arrived. That was a lie. No migraine. I'm scared of this month's conversation. That's the bad truth. Rule's the rule. Your call. Sadie sat with the phone for a long while, and then she wrote back the sentence she thinks might be the actual hinge on which this whole story finally turns, more than the folder, more even than the door. A confessed lie counts as a truth. That's how the math works now. See you next month. She was there the next month. First table by the window. Her mother and she are slower going, but going. Lynn came down to the city in April, and they had lunch together, and she talked, unprompted, about the therapist she and Tom had started seeing, her father's idea, which Sadie still considers the single bravest sentence of his entire life. In the car afterward, looking straight through the windshield rather than at Sadie, her mother said only, "I should have pulled the records myself. I'm a nurse. I know how to read a chart. I just didn't want to." That was all she said. It isn't everything. It's something. Sadie has stopped billing people for everything, she finds. The interest on that particular ledger was eating her alive, and nobody, in the end, was making her pay it but herself. Her mother still runs toward whoever in the room is bleeding. Last month it was a neighbor's kidney stone, and Sunday dinner waited an hour for it, but Sadie no longer measures her own worth by the weight of what her mother chooses to carry. Brooke is still at the nursery, promoted now to the perennial section, which she says, with a small dry laugh that is entirely new to her, is exactly the right section for people learning how to come back, reliably, year after year, without anyone having to ask them to. The installments arrive on the 1st of every month, Brooke's to their parents, and Brooke's to Sadie, the same round schoolgirl numbers, shrinking 2 debts at once, a little further every time. On Sadie's wall now, between her diploma, still waiting on its frame for May, and that photograph from their grandmother's yard, hangs a small brass magnet shaped like the scales of justice. It isn't holding anything up anymore. It just hangs there, level, balanced, doing nothing more than existing in its proper place. Some Saturdays, on her way out the door to coffee, she flicks it level with one finger, for luck, though it never actually needs the help. She used to think forgiveness meant walking back through the old door and pretending the frame had never cracked. She knows better now. It can be smaller than that, and stronger. A new door, built to size, with one honest rule for a hinge, and a lock that actually works, and, for once, the key sitting in her own pocket, exactly where it should have been the entire time. And,